of direct air capture, opportunities for negative emissions in the United States. My name is Emma Tomley, and I'm the State and Regional Policy Specialist on GPI's Carbon Management team, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar. Today's agenda includes remarks from GPI staff, a presentation of the Atlas from our partners at Carbon Solutions, and policy takeaways from Jessie Stolark, the Executive Director of the Carbon Capture Coalition. Before we begin, I wanted to note a few quick items. The first is that if you haven't yet had the chance to read the Atlas, it's available at carboncaptureready.betterenergy.org, and we'll be placing a link in the chat later on in today's presentations. Secondly, the event is being recorded, and the recording will be available within the next week. We've also reserved time after the presentation for questions, and there will be two ways to ask a question. The first is to enter it into the Q&A chat to be read aloud or to use the raise hand feature. For the Q&A chat, please feel free to enter those questions at any time. And when asking a question, please be sure to include your name and affiliation. With that, I'm pleased to introduce the two GPI staff kicking off today's presentations. Matt Fry, the Senior Policy Manager on our Carbon Management team, will start us off by providing a background on GPI and the Atlas. Next, Ryan Kammer, GPI's Research Manager, will follow with an overview of direct air capture. Take it away, Matt.
Thanks, Emma. Morning, everybody. Next slide, please. So just most of you are probably familiar with GPI or Great Plains Institute, but just an overview of who we are and what we do briefly. We're an independent NGO, not politically driven, have no specific technology bent, and kind of looking at all of the above strategies. The carbon management team's primary focus is to expand and accelerate economy-wide deployment of the entire carbon management suite. This is looking both at industrial, thermal, and all of the above sorts of opportunities to address climate goals. Next slide. So as you can see from the slide, we're not new. GPI has been working on these issues for over 2 decades, I say, working in a number of different capacities. One of our primary functions is to facilitate stakeholder engagement and working with groups to try to work on difficult, challenging issues and try to bring together not necessarily common interest into a common finality. So next slide, please. At GPI, we work with, at this point, 4 or 5 different projects. I'll run through these really quickly just to give you an idea of who does what. So I work with our state and regional carbon teams, working on specifically that opportunities and policies to help states further deploy carbon management projects. We also have the Carbon Capture Coalition. Jessie's with us today, and they're our federal arm working on federal policies to support carbon management. We also have the Industrial Innovation Initiative, whose focus is to work both at the state and federal levels on, and those are difficult to abate industrial emissions. And then finally, our newest project is the Carbon Action Alliance, and they work across all of our teams to provide greater outreach and advocacy for carbon management across the suite. Next slide, please. For those of you that aren't necessarily familiar with our history of analytical work, we tend to use data analysis to help support project and policy deployment. This is just a snapshot of some of the work we've done in recent years. We started with a transport infrastructure analysis. We'll have more of those coming out in the near future. We also did some job and economic analysis with Rhodium Group to try to spotlight the opportunities and advantages of deployment of carbon management project. Once again, over the coming year, we'll have 3 or 4 additional jobs and economic analysis coming out through Rhodium. We've distilled a lot of our information into fact sheets, which are available on our website. Emma and Grace do a great job of legislative tracking on a weekly basis to provide information as to what the various state legislative branches doing over their sessions. And then most recently, we did a carbon and hydrogen hub analysis that looked at those opportunities to deploy, realistic opportunities to deploy carbon and hydrogen hubs across the country. So with that, next slide, please. It made a lot of sense for us to do what we're here to talk about today. With all the federal incentives and the motivation to deploy direct air capture, hubs or projects across the country, we thought it would be a great idea to once again partner with Carbon Solutions and develop this atlas on opportunities nationally, full spectrum, with the myriad of technologies to look at opportunities for direct air capture facilities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan and let him talk you through more of the specifics and what we dug into with the analysis. Once again, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, as Matt and Emma mentioned, my name is Ryan Kammer. I'm the research manager here for the carbon management team at GPI. I'll be giving a quick overview of both direct air capture as well as some other kind of needs for carbon dioxide removal. You can go to the next slide. So to begin, direct air capture describes kind of a suite of technologies there are technology-based approaches for removing CO2. You may hear the terms engineering-based, chemically-based, mechanically based. It really is all of those things to directly remove the CO2 from the air. And then once you've removed that, it acts in a similar way as you would from other carbon management practices, where you're going to compress it, transport it, and store it permanently in a geologic formation. On the left, you have the two main types of direct air capture that we typically kind of separate things into. The first is a low temperature DAC. This typically system would use a solid sorbent and have a low temperature for after the sorbent has been used to remove the CO2 from the air. The low temperature is required to release the CO2 from that sorbent, which then can now be compressed, transported, and stored. And then a high temperature, as the name would suggest, uses a high temperature with a liquid solvent to do a similar mechanism of removing the CO2 from the air, separating the CO2 from the process that was used to remove it, compressing and transporting and storing. We're the Atlas, while we're encouraged by kind of the advancements in the electric only direct air capture, because of the technology readiness level of low temp and high temp compared to the electric, we kind of focus on these two opportunities. Next slide, please. So yeah, stepping back, why we need direct air capture and other methods of carbon dioxide removal. I want to start on the left. The figure on the left is showing global emissions and the modeled amounts through time moving forward. To start, you see the two white dashed lines. These are the estimates of how much CO2 we can emit over the coming decade or decades to limit our temperature rise to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Couple that or compare that to what we are currently estimated to emit over the coming decades with the red line, the yellow line. These are only two modeled estimates of how much CO2 we'll be emitting. There are certainly many others that are showing that we are likely going to overshoot that without drastic changes to our carbon reduction practices and other mitigation opportunities. So because of that, because we're likely going to be overshooting, it's becoming increasingly likely that we're going to need negative emissions through things like direct air capture, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, afforestation, reforestation. Maybe there's some practices using the ocean as a carbon sink. There are different opportunities that we're going to have to look at to lower the atmospheric concentrations of CO2. Additionally, on the right, you can see that even some industries like iron and steel, cement, and chemicals, a lot of, or not a lot, but there are parts of their process that even with best practices and changes in decarbonization methods, we are likely going to have process emissions that may be very difficult to abate. And so because of that, even net zero emissions models like the International Energy Agency's net zero emissions by 2050 modeling attempt shows that even in a net zero scenario, you may have to use direct air capture to offset high volumes of CO2 from industrial sources that don't have a techno-economic possibility in the near term for mitigating. Next slide, please. I mentioned that direct air capture is one of a few different methods for carbon dioxide removal. It's one of the technology-based with bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. There are certainly nature-based like afforestation and reforestation, changing the way we manage land and do our farming, things like that. All of these have their own advantages and disadvantages. They have different places that they can have opportunities. Their water and land requirements and costs are going to vary. We really see that all of these approaches are likely going to be required to meet our global climate goals. And so we did the Atlas to show really where around the country, for the United States specifically, would direct air capture be an optimal opportunity. Next slide. Now with that, one of the things that you'll see described by the Carbon Solutions team is that low temperature and high temperature DAC have different energy demands, both both thermal energy through what heat source is going to be used to separate the CO2, as well as electricity supply and demand requirements. And so really, all I want to point out here is that the low temperature direct air capture, for those of you that aren't geologists, 100 degrees Celsius is certainly something that can be acquired through geothermal heat in some parts of the country. This is the method that we're seeing as part of what Climeworks is doing, is they're using geothermal heat to be able to both supply the electricity potentially, but also separate the CO2 during their process. When you get into the higher temperature DAC opportunities, 900 degrees Celsius would certainly be a challenge from a geothermal heat supply economically, for sure. And so you're looking at likely something that would maybe be a natural gas facility with carbon capture and storage, or some other high thermal opportunity that the Carbon Solutions team will describe throughout the atlas. So with that, I will pass it on to the rest of the team. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, for that excellent overview. With that, we will start the presentation of the atlas by staff from Carbon Solutions, who we partnered with. First, you'll hear from Elizabeth Abramson, the team's research analyst and design specialist, on the study approach and analytical considerations for the atlas. Next, you'll hear from Jonathan Ogland-Hand, the director of energy systems analysis, who will talk more about the heat and energy requirements needed for DAC. And then from Amy George, scientist at Carbon Solutions, about waste heat and power related to direct air capture. And with that, Elizabeth, go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Emma. We can skip ahead a couple slides, I think. Yeah, so this atlas was created to examine the physical, geologic, and industrial landscape of the United States to find the best regional opportunities for siting direct air capture projects. Our study examined 6 key categories in energy resources and other siting conditions that support ideal performance of direct air capture as a negative emissions technology. This analysis resulted in the map of overall DAC suitability scores shown here, with darker green areas representing regions with the greatest concentration of beneficial siting characteristics we examined in our study, and we'll be circling back to this map in later slides. You can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the study team looked across 6 major categories of DAC facility siting considerations, each with multiple data layers as detailed in the table shown here. This table and much more data and additional definitions are provided in the atlas, which you can download today at carboncaptureready.org. At a high level, the categories we studied were geologic carbon storage and transport infrastructure, electric grid generation, carbon intensity and cost, low carbon heat resources, access to natural gas for process heat with carbon capture, potential for waste heat recovery or combined heat and power, and atmospheric conditions for optimal facility operation. Next slide. To conduct our analysis, we created a grid of hexagon-shaped grid cells across the United States, which was then used to score and aggregate information from every data source listed on the previous slide. This diagram shows how individual data layers are scored and summed to produce a category score, and then all category scores are combined to produce an overall score for each hexagon cell across the country. This diagram and more detailed methodology descriptions are provided in the atlas as well. Slide, thanks. Here we can take a quick look at the resulting score maps for each category. We'll zoom in on most of these during the rest of this presentation. So I'll pause for a moment here to let you take a quick look at the maps. And I'll note that we show electricity twice, once in the near term or midterm for 2030, and once in the long term for 2050, as we expect the electricity landscape to change as electric utilities and regional planning organizations around the country evolve to meet their renewable energy and decarbonization goals for mid-century. So here we return to the final map showing overall DAC suitability scores, which combines all of those individual category scores we saw on the previous slide. You'll notice multiple areas of the country appearing as a white or blank cell. For the most part, these are areas where the data does not indicate significant potential for geologic carbon storage, which was a key factor used to screen out those areas. Long-distance transport of CO2 would allow more areas to participate in DAC, but this new infrastructure would likely add to the overall cost of a DAC project. Now I'll hand things off to my colleague, Jonathan Ogland-Hand, Director of Energy Systems Analysis at Carbon Solutions, to talk about DAC facility components and energy requirements, as well as geologic storage potential and low carbon energy resources.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Next slide, please. So this is some information that Ryan previously discussed also, but there are direct air capture, taking ambient air and removing the CO2 from it is very energy intensive because we're only talking about 400-ish parts per million of CO2. And so there's energy required both to run the fans and also to separate the CO2 with heat. And so there are many different types of direct air capture that are being developed by just various companies throughout the world. And this study used information from previously published peer-reviewed sources. And the two primary technologies that are available throughout most literature, like was previously discussed, are high and low temp direct air capture. Low temp is based on solid adsorbents, and high temp uses liquid solvents. And so the diagram here on the right shows the various components involved in these processes. So in reality, of course, you would have two separate facilities, and they're shown here together just for illustration and comparison purposes. And then finally, other note I wanted to mention is that there is a wide range of different projections on what the size of a single DAC facility might be. Many companies are trying to work on that and look at various economies of scales and the techno-economic considerations. The data shown in this table says between 10 kilotons to a million or a megaton a year. There's a wide range, like I said, and for example, the Department of Energy's DAC hub program, they define a DAC hub as having at least 1 million tons a year, and that being comprised of many different facilities, each with a minimum of 50 kilotons per year. Next slide, please. And so looking at these criteria of to locate where these for the DAC Atlas, access to carbon storage was a key criteria, like Elizabeth mentioned. And that CO2 storage can occur either in saline aquifers, dedicated storage for that, or also in current or historic oil and gas fields. And so to determine where these geologic resources occur, this study looked at both the U.S. Department of Energy's NatCarb database as well as Carbon Solutions SCOT database, just to look for where these formations with potential to store CO2 existed. And so locations in the atlas with a higher score indicate higher certainty for having this potential. The cost and capacity of CO2 storage can vary widely across these areas, even those with a high score. And more detailed studies are needed to identify the most feasible and least cost locations. And then, of course, actually constructing a CO2 storage site would require local site characterization and on-site drilling. And then lastly, like Elizabeth mentioned, CO2 transportation infrastructure can also extend the range of potential locations for a DAC facility or a DAC hub, but that could add substantial cost and complexity to the projects. Next slide. And so this is the resulting score showing the hexagonal grid score that went into the atlas for geologic storage opportunities across the data layers. And like Elizabeth mentioned, access to storage criteria for this study acted as a screening where multiple areas of the US with white or blank cells were seen as not optimal for developing a DAC facility, unless, of course, you had a long distance CO2 transport infrastructure. And so these locations generally align with the regions previously identified in GPI reports as having potential to become industrial carbon hubs. Those hubs would be the previously reported would be centered on areas with concentrated industrial activity that would serve as a source of CO2. And so these hubs are more focused here on what areas have access to CO2 storage. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, and Ryan mentioned, there's it's very energy intensive to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so because the whole purpose of DAC is to provide negative emissions, it's important that this energy has as low of a carbon footprint as possible. And so there are many different options for low carbon heat. I'm going to talk about some of the renewable energy options. First would be geothermal resources. And so broadly in the geothermal community, there are 3 different types of resources: hydrothermal, enhanced geothermal, and sedimentary basins. And like Ryan mentioned, the 100 degrees C or the low temperature DAC heat demand is an option for geothermal, whereas the higher 900 C probably isn't. And so for this atlas, higher scores were given to locations with temperatures of at least 100 C across these 3 different resource bases, as suggested with the map. Next slide. And then the other renewable energy options for heat would be solar and also biomass. And so this study used data from the National Renewable Energies National Solar Radiation Database to score solar irradiance around the country. And then also from the National Renewable Energy Lab, the Biopower Atlas to estimate the amount of biomass residue from agriculture and wood waste throughout the country. Next slide. And so putting it all together, all these different options for renewable heat, biomass, geothermal, and solar, you can see here that there are opportunities throughout the country, and these resulting scores here, the more green locations had all of those renewable energy options or more of them. And that comes from biomass, which was distributed across the country, and then solar and geothermal heat. The best opportunities tend to be broadly distributed in the West and the Southwest United States. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Amy.
All right, thank you. So Jonathan has been covering sources of clean thermal energy that could provide the heat needed for DAC. And the next slide is going to show another continuation of that topic. So another opportunity for heat for DAC is the use of waste heat in industry. It's been estimated that more than half of all industrial heat is lost, but it could be reused for the temperature ranges that are appropriate for DAC. So to add another layer of possibilities to the DAC map for convenient siting locations, we looked at waste heat recovery and combined heat and power. So waste heat recovery is what it sounds like, is the capture and use of excess waste heat from industry, and CHP is the use of excess heat from electricity generation. And the table on the right here shows the types of industrial processes and units that would be conducive to waste heat capture within different industrial sectors. On the map, what we're showing is existing combined heat and power from a DOE data set. Those are the yellow dots. And the greenish dots are potential waste heat recovery facilities based on an Oak Ridge National Laboratory study that identified sectors where the types of waste heat generated would be conducive for DAC. So what we did is we took a data set of fuel use estimated by NREL and subsetted it to those facilities within those sectors. And then we're showing it on the map here sized by the fuel use at those facilities as a demonstration of places with potential waste heat recovery. So in our scoring system, existing or potential facilities within one of those grid hexagons received a high score. And if there were no facilities within the hexagon, it received no extra benefit for citing DAC. You can go to the next slide, please. So another set of layers pertains to the electric grid that would be providing electricity for these DAC hubs sometime in the near future. So there's 6 layers, 3 of them are for 2030, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, and 3 of them are for 2050. This is just one of those 6 layers representing the predicted carbon intensity of the grid in the future at 2030. And for this estimate, we use the long-range marginal emissions rate as a proxy for how much extra carbon intensity a DAC system would put on top of the expected baseload energy demand of this modeled future grid. We're using NREL's Reed's market and economic forecasting model. On the right over here, you can see a histogram that's showing the that long-run marginal emissions rate across these different regions shown on the map. So you can see that there's a kind of a broad range of regions having these values of greenhouse gas intensity in this 2030 prediction. On the map, the darker areas are places where the marginal emissions rate is expected to be higher in 2030. So adding a DAC facility would likely have a higher carbon intensity than in the lighter areas. Just to note that on this map, the colors are reversed for the final layer maps that you've seen so far, where darker is better for siting DAC. Here on this map, it's reversed. So lighter is better for siting DAC. And then there are 2 other layers for 2030, which are not shown here. They're also from the Reed's model, and those are electricity cost, which is scored from lowest cost to highest cost, so that we can identify areas where the electricity might be cheaper and help out with the overall economics of the DAC facilities. And the other layer that we're not showing is net load, which was used to identify areas where capacity might be strained versus where you have extra excess generation compared to the demand. On the next slide, please. So in 2050, the landscape has changed somewhat in the Reed's model predictions. We now see that the average emissions rate from the grid is much lower than on the previous slide. So if you look over at the histogram on the right, now instead of seeing these bars distributed across those rates, they're mostly less than 100 kilograms CO2 per megawatt hour generated. And overall on the map too, the color scheme, we're still showing the same 5 quintiles, but the overall rates are much lower. So once again, in this case, the darker areas receive the lowest score and the lightest areas are receiving the highest score for suitability of siting DAC. Once again, there are 2 more layers for 2050, which again are the electricity cost and the net load. So that's a total of 6 more layers showing the near and the slightly longer term, or the mid and longer term electric grid considerations for DAC suitability. If you'll go to the next slide, please. So those are the layers that we're going to discuss in detail, but as Elizabeth described, once the layers are all summed across 17 factors that were considered in these 6 categories, we have this final map that she showed earlier. And again, the darker cells are favorable for DAC, while the lighter cells or no color are considered less suitable or not suitable. And we can see some of the primary drivers of the suitability of DAC in these different regions. So for example, some of the darkest areas in the far north and in the Rockies are driven by geologic storage potential, geothermal and natural gas availability. And we just saw in the previous 2 maps that the sort of North Dakota area had really favorable electric grid characteristics in those 2030 and 2050 modeling forecasts. So all of that suggests really favorable conditions in this region for siting DAC up there in the Rockies and Northern Plains. But one of the factors that North Dakota and the north there doesn't have is warmer air temperatures, which is one of the factors that was considered that we haven't shown in these more detailed slides, but it is covered in the atlas. So looking at Southern California, its suitability compared to North Dakota's is driven more by biomass and solar, existing CHP, combined heat and power, and even the ambient air temperature considerations. And then in the Permian Basin region, again, it's a very favorable combination of carbon capture and storage opportunity, low cost energy, abundant solar, and higher air temperatures. And similarly, the Gulf Coast is also warm and humid, has geothermal potential, geologic storage opportunities and infrastructure there as well. Moving up to the Mid-Atlantic and Great Lakes, on the other hand, there the favorability comes from existing and potential waste heat recovery and natural gas availability, And the Midwest also has abundant industry and a forecast for the lower cost clean energy that we talked about. So lastly, in the Midcontinent, that's the central portion where there's some nice darker green color. There we have favorable attributes for carbon storage, lots of opportunities for clean energy, and low forecasted cost of energy and geothermal and biomass opportunities. So that sort of covers the regions that the DAC Atlas, it has colored this sort of darker green, more favorable color. And so that's it for my slides.
Thank you, Amy, and everyone at Carbon Solutions for that wonderful overview of the Atlas. We'll now turn to Jessie Stolark, the Executive Director of the Carbon Capture Coalition, which is convened by the Great Plains Institute, to provide some policy takeaways about direct air capture.
Thanks, Emma. And I first just want to compliment my colleagues at GPI and Carbon Solutions for this tremendous new resource on DAC deployment and factors that should be considered for siting DAC in the United States. So before I dive into my presentation, if you're not already familiar with the coalition, we bring together more than 100 members in the industry, labor, and nonprofit space, all working together in common cause to enact and implement a supportive federal policy framework for the deployment of carbon management technologies. And when we use the term carbon management, we're referring to a full suite of technologies, including carbon capture, direct air capture, transport, reuse, and storage technologies. And so I'm going to dive a little deeper into the policies that are really going to drive DAC deployment over the next decade and even longer here in the United States. Policies aimed at deploying direct air capture at significant scale were a particular focus of the previous Congress, and DAC has received a huge amount of bipartisan support from lawmakers and stakeholders. This is evident in the historic laws that were enacted in the previous Congress concerning both carbon management and DAC. And I'll talk more about this portfolio of policies in a moment, but first I'm going to talk about what makes direct air capture such a bipartisan issue. So ultimately what makes advocates of these technologies so effective is that we are building support for climate and energy policy by bringing different policymakers to the table for different reasons. So long as you believe in the need for commercialization of DAC, whether you're a climate hawk like Sheldon Whitehouse or Representative Scott Peters, or your top priority is protecting good paying union jobs like members from Rust Belt states, or supporting regional economies that have historically relied on domestic energy production like Senators Manchin and Barrasso. So the previous presenters today have talked about the need for carbon dioxide removal and DAC from a climate perspective. And a broad cross-section of Congress realizes the outsized role that removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere will play in permanently removing and storing CO2 to not only reach net zero emissions, but also mid-century climate goals. But they also recognize that DAC is an innovative technology that can support regional economies, particularly those that are historically energy-producing regions, including former coal regions and oil and gas regions. These facilities can provide jobs in highly skilled trades, including equipment and facility component manufacturing, including steel and cement. There are also tremendous opportunities in construction and engineering jobs with the construction of these DAC facilities. And then moving to the day-to-day operation of such DAC facilities, there are jobs required for inputs to the facilities, such as absorbance and energy needs, as well as operations and maintenance. These types of jobs require highly skilled labor, primarily from the trades, whether that's steel workers or pipe fitters, plant operators, or construction trades. And I'll just add that these jobs are typically family-sustaining jobs that support regional economies. And we're talking about, as you can see, are hundreds of thousands of direct jobs if we are scaling up this industry to meet anticipated need for net zero and global temperature targets. So you can go to the next slide. So this interest across the political spectrum has translated into tangible and historic progress in the last Congress for carbon management technologies more broadly, but for DAC especially. In addition to the DAC Hub programs, which I'll talk about in a moment, the bipartisan infrastructure law provides over $12 billion in funding over a 5-year period to scale the carbon management industry, including funding for parts of the supply chain that will be crucial to scaling DAC in the next several decades. This includes grants and loans for CO2 transport and storage networks, monies for carbon storage, the commercial DAC prizes, as well as complementary programs that will ultimately benefit DAC deployment, including carbon reuse, funding to scale permitting capacity at the state and federal level, and more. And not listed here, but there are other complementary funded programs, including the regional clean hydrogen hubs and funding aimed at carbon capture demonstration and large-scale deployment. And then I'll also just mention, in addition to this funding provided by the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's also been support for DAC through annual appropriations, including most recently the creation of a CDR procurement program in the fiscal year 2023 omnibus appropriations. You can go to the next slide. So this slide should be familiar, I would assume, to most folks here on this webinar. So I'll run through this fairly quickly. But in addition to the bipartisan infrastructure law, last Congress saw the most significant climate policy ever passed by the US Congress, the Inflation Reduction Act. Among the reforms made to several clean energy tax credits in the bill, the tax-based carbon management policies represent the most transformative enhancements to the 45Q tax credit since its inception in 2008. Coupled with the investments that were included in the infrastructure law, the U.S. now stands to have the most comprehensive and far-reaching federal policy support for carbon management technologies in the world. We expect that these investments taken together could fuel a 13-fold growth of carbon management capacity in the U.S. by 2035. So just going through these enhancements to the 45Q tax credit quickly, it includes a multi-year extension of the commenced construction window. Now any carbon capture, direct air capture, or carbon utilization project that commences construction before January 1st, 2033 can qualify for 45Q. And this provides a critically needed investment horizon for projects to scale up between now and mid-century. It also includes a direct pay provision. And so for the first time, the statute includes a direct pay option for a handful of tax credits, including 45Q. And so for-profit entities may elect direct payments for the first 5 years of a project after the equipment is placed in service. And then for nonprofit organizations and co-op led projects, a direct pay option is even more expansive, allowing these projects to receive direct payments for the full 12 years of the credit. Taxpayers may now also elect to transfer their tax credits to any other tax-paying entity, either after the 5-year direct pay period or for the full 12 years. 45Q credit values have also been increased across the board, most significantly for direct air capture. For DAC, it increases the credit provided to geologic storage to $180 for secure geologic storage of CO2 captured for DAC, and $130 for CO2 that is sourced from DAC, and then either reused to make commercial products or for the storage or for subsequent storage in oil and gas fields. And then last but not least, I'll also mention that these enhancements included significantly reduced capture thresholds, expanding the number and types of facilities that can qualify for the tax credit. So you can go to the next slide. So as we've touched on, previous presenters have touched on today, the infrastructure law also directs $3.5 billion over 5 years for the development of 4 regional DAC hubs. So last December, the Department of Energy made available nearly half of this funding, and submission deadlines for full applications to this initial round of funding are due on March 13th. The rest of the funding will be made available in 2024 or later. So, but what is a DAC hub, you might ask? It's a great question. And so in essence, DOE defines a DAC hub as a single DAC or a network of DAC projects, as well as potential CO2 storage or reuse options or transport infrastructure that are capable of capturing, storing, and or reusing 1 million metric tons of CO2 per year. The selection of DAC hubs locations will take into consideration economically distressed, fossil-producing regions with high levels of coal, oil, or natural gas resources. And then, of course, as discussed today, DOE will also consider factors including local availability of renewable and low-carbon energy production, resource availability, as well as existing infrastructure. And then, I'll also talk in a moment about fit of potential sites from a social and environmental justice standpoint. So, and as you see here on this slide, the current funding opportunity announcements allow for DOE to fund projects that are in a variety of maturity phases, from feasibility studies through design and build. And on this schedule here, DOE could identify 2 of the potential hubs locations yet this year. So that's really exciting. So you can go to the next slide. So lastly, I just wanted to touch on the intersection of DAC hubs and the DAC hubs program and equity. Selected projects must comply with the administration's Justice 40 initiative, which is a whole of government plan to ensure that 40% of overall benefits of certain federal investments benefit disadvantaged communities, as well as those historically marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. Project developers funded under the DAC Hubs program must include an in-depth environmental pollution impact assessment and analysis of cumulative pollution, including non-CO2 impacts from project deployment. Additionally, Department of Energy will require a community benefits plan, which includes specific criteria for the development and implementation throughout the project. And community benefits agreements are a legal agreement between community benefit groups and developers, which stipulate the benefits a developer agrees to fund or furnish in exchange for community support of a project. So with that sort of kind of whirlwind tour through the policy landscape, I'm going to hand things back to Emma for the Q&A.
Thank you, Jessie. We will now move into the Q&A portion of today's webinar. Thank you to those of you that have already put questions in the chat. As a reminder, you can ask questions in two different ways. The first is to place your question in the Q&A box. The second is to use the raise hand feature. When using either of those methods, please make sure to share both your name and affiliation. We'll start with a question from Roger Ullman. Roger asked, do you believe the saline storage data are complete, or are there some states or regions where the mapping is incomplete? It seems implausible that Illinois has lots of capacity, but its neighbors Missouri, Iowa, and Wisconsin have none at all. This results in the big white space in your synthesis slide, implying no political benefit in those states.
Yeah, I wonder if this would be a great question for Jonathan to jump in and talk a little bit about the Scott model from Carbon Solutions and how that kind of evolves the data we have available from DOE and other sources.
So I'm happy to talk about Ryan also, I would say, would be a good resource as a geologist with experience in the Midwest, talk about the extent of the Illinois basin. Ryan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start, with the saline storage data. The backbone of it, as Jonathan will talk about in a second about the Scott model, is the DOE NatCarb database. Now, in some cases, there might be a little bit of incomplete. One of the challenges with doing a nationwide saline storage estimates is that you don't necessarily have all the data points available, because like in some places, I'm in Indiana, in the Illinois basin, the Mount Simon sandstone is the main target in Indiana, Illinois for storage, and it's so deep that there's not a lot of data points, not a lot of wells that have penetrated it. Now, in some cases, geologically, you're typically going to be looking, without getting too technical, you're looking in the basins where you've had sediment deposition, where you have formations that can take the CO2, essentially. And so with Missouri, Iowa, and Wisconsin, there's potential there, maybe in some of the corners of it that we part of some other basins around the area, but they're likely not in areas that have deep sedimentary basin deposition. Now, that's not to say that there may not be other rock formations that have potential. I mentioned earlier Climeworks in Iceland. They're using basalt storage. And so Iowa, I know, has some deep basalt formations that could be potential locations. They just haven't necessarily been explored for saline storage in the way that we typically have in the US. So there certainly would be, but generally speaking, the ranges or the locations are pretty good estimates for where there might be good storage. And even then, you still are probably you're going to have to do some sort of characterization of your site to confirm this as part of your Class 6 EPA application. But Jonathan, do you want to go ahead and explain Scott and how that kind of incorporates cost?
Sure. So I would just say, like, this study here was really focused on where these basins were and where they were not. And so, like Ryan mentioned, there's different extents of these basins, and so that really drove kind of that white versus non-white area that you see on the map.
Next up, we'll go to Gibbons from the UKCCS Research Center and University of Sheffield. John asks, there may be opportunities to reduce DAC energy by combining capture from air with capture from flue gases, with maybe similar tonnages for DAC and the flue gas. Have you considered this? Synergies are a combined use of solvent, also heat and cooling tower integration.
So yeah, we did not consider that sort of configuration for this analysis. We looked at sort of exhaust and flue gas as a source for heat in combined heat and power and waste heat capture facilities. I think there's also opportunities for carbon capture from retrofit of existing industrial power facilities to sort of contribute to the construction of an overall network of CO2 transport, which would make DAC more likely, more feasible. But that I think is an interesting area of study, but we did not include something like that.
I guess I did see briefly a question about looking at earthquakes, and then it was taken down. I think that is an important messaging tool. As I'm assuming the question was probably around induced seismicity for injection. Being a geologist, I have some background and understanding in those, and I do think it is one of those questions that those of us who are part of this industry and are starting to see more of the stakeholder engagement. It's a fair question for many people to have. Fortunately, I think that with CO2 injection, the permitting process with Class 6 wells, as well as just kind of the studies that have been shown around CO2 injection, it's not really considered a major issue because of the pressure management of a Class 6 well is a little bit different than maybe what you're going to be doing or what has been done at times with water injection. And so I see this as a geologist, I see the risk being generally minimal if done properly.
Thanks, Ryan. As we wait for any last questions from the audience, it would be great to hear from a number of our presenters today what they see as the biggest challenge facing direct air capture moving forward.
I can provide a general perspective. I think recent policy has really helped even the playing field for some of these negative emissions opportunities, and I think Jessie gave a good rundown of that. But I think at this point, with carbon seen as something that you can utilize in some cases, but mostly something you have to store in the long term without necessarily generating revenue, I think that makes project financing pretty challenging. So I think all of the policy in the past few years has really helped companies plan their investments. And I don't know if Jessie wants to kind of jump in and say where things might go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Dane. I was going to say something sort of similar. I think, from a more of an advocacy policy perspective, this is still a very young industry. I believe there are, don't quote me, but I believe there's about 18 facilities globally, and most of those are demonstration facilities. So, the challenge is really, given the time frames that we're talking about in terms of the climate goals and what the role that DAC is going to play, alongside a whole host of other technologies. How are we going to scale the industry appropriately? And that includes, ensuring that projects are properly cited. It includes a lot of regulatory and permitting work that needs to be done. And so I don't think the challenge is DACs alone, right? We have so many different clean energy technologies that just need to be scaled at an incredible rate, but really looking kind of at the next 10 years, essentially, and how we get this industry growing, that is a tremendous challenge.
And I'll add a little bit from a state perspective. It's as Jessie mentioned, it's not terribly different than the other technologies that we're trying to deploy. And as we all know, the science is clear that we need to deploy all of them if we're going to address climate. But the states are working through processes in many instances to allow frameworks to build projects in their states. I think we need to continue to build out these statutory frameworks in states so projects are viable. And then once again, as Jessie had mentioned, I think the use of land, water, electricity, all of those aspects need to be considered, as well as the impacts on people as we build out these projects and these infrastructure. So there's no lack for challenges, but I don't think that should prevent us from trying to move forward and doing what's necessary.
Thanks, Matt. It looks like we have a question from John from New Mexico Tech. Will you in the future consider community and public acceptance of DAC? Jessie, I think this touches a little bit on what you were talking about related to direct air capture and equity, if you'd like to field an answer to this question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an analyst, but I think looking at the Stack Hub's report, one thing I was really thinking about as I read it is, we can look at suitability of location in terms of resource availability and energy availability to power these facilities and other factors. But what are the communities that will want to host this technology, that will not only see benefit from deploying the technology, whether that be in terms of jobs and economic development, but that actually are willing hosts of the technology. And I see a couple other questions in the chat around this. I think for the public, there's not a lot of understanding around even what carbon management technologies are. And then drilling down a little further, what is a direct air capture? That is a very valid question. And so I think, from a project developer's perspective, the conversation needs to start really early and very frank and open, and to start to have that conversation with potential host communities so that they can understand, not only what this technology is, but then also come to an agreement around what are the community benefits that we want to see out of deploying this technology. So that would be my plug for further analyses is what is, in terms of suitability and demographics for kind of host communities going forward.
And I guess with that, I'll just plug the Carbon Action Alliance, one of the wings that GPI is focused on the stakeholder engagement side, and really both educating those who really have no reason to be familiar with these technologies, but also listening to their questions and concerns throughout the country. And so I definitely do see that a lot of work needs to be done, and this is not just with DAC or CCS. It's really with anything where land use is involved. There's a lot of just conversations that need to be had. And so we're because it's grown so quickly in the last 5 or 10 years, it feels overwhelming at times, but really it's just we're going through and working on ways to communicate and engage with those around us.
Thanks, Ryan and Jessie. Elizabeth, could you add any insight as to the feasibility or difficulty of incorporating something like that into the report, incorporating community engagement or preference for DAC siting in their community?
Sure. I mean, at a basic level, we have demographic data, and as we saw the map earlier that was presented by Jessie, we have the official map of disadvantaged communities identified by the Council on Environmental Quality. So from a data perspective, it can be, as much as just putting it on a map, seeing what overlaps and what doesn't, but there's so much more complexity behind it, and so much more that would have to go on the scale of an individual community, that sometimes from a national perspective, mapping might not be the best fit for a specific project deployment. But yeah, it's definitely a huge consideration how we can take our most well-meaning intentions behind ensuring that Justice 40 is carried out throughout the DAC Hubs project, and turning that into action.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It looks like there might be another question for you in the chat from Sangeet Nepal, Indiana University, Bloomington. Is there a reason for assigning 2 points, a 2-point score for the existing carbon dioxide pipelines, while almost all factors are assigned a 4-point score except for humidity?
I can try to answer that one. I don't think there's a specific reason. The existing CO2 pipelines had a very strong correlation with other existing activity, like oil field activity that may be potential injection and utilization locations, as well as the best areas of geologic storage. So I think given that there's overlap and correlation between 3 to 6 other layers, that score was mostly appropriate.
Thanks, Dane. Next up, a question from Ethan Spira. How do we develop financial incentives to store carbon? Jessie, this could be a good question for you, or perhaps for you, Matt.
I can start, Emma, and then Matt, if you have other things to add. For carbon management technologies broadly, 45Q and the value associated with storing that CO2 is going to be the primary driver, to access the 45Q tax credit, you have to show that you have stored or utilized the CO2 through reporting mechanisms. But for direct air capture, there's also a lot of subnational interest developing or private sector interest developing, whether that's, private purchasing or advanced market commitments that we're seeing tons of progress on in the last few years, or for example, California's low carbon fuel standard has a DAC protocol. And so I think there's a kind of a variety of mechanisms coming together to incentivize carbon removal and storage with DAC.
And just to add from the state perspective, like clearly the states do not have the deep pockets that the federal government, so they cannot personally, deploy incentives such as 45Q just because they can't afford it, but they do have opportunities to provide incentives financially at a smaller scale that kind of help with incentives, whether they be reduced taxes on things such as real estate or sales tax, or potential opportunities to reduce severances if this is used for enhanced recovery. While not the main goal with DAC, it is clearly one of the markets that we may see interaction with direct air capture. There's also the opportunity for states to provide, assistance with siting and permitting expediency and things of that nature. So while they can't provide the per tonnage, I guess, direct financial incentive, they can do a number of things that can reduce time and capital expenditures to build out these projects.
Thank you, Matt and Jessie. And with that, it looks like we are at time for today's questions. But thank you to all of the staff from the Great Plains Institute and Carbon Solutions for your incredible presentations today, and for those of you in the audience for asking such insightful questions. We look forward to next time, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.